Thank you. Thank you once again for that really warm, wonderful welcome. I'm really excited to be in Austin. This is actually my second time here, and my company might not enjoy it, but this has been significantly better than the first time. So really, really love it. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Cortez Frazier. As our wonderful hostess has mentioned, I will be talking about software bill of materials today. I'm going to try my hardest to make software bill of materials sexy for you, which is a difficult topic, but we will try to find a way as we kind of talk about things. I do want to kind of start with just a brief introduction of myself, maybe a bit of background, why you should listen to anything that I have to say today. From there, we'll kind of walk into really deep background, what software bill of materials are, why are these coming up as requirements from both a regulatory and from a customer perspective, and then finally, we'll start to get into some of the problems that you have to deal with them, and most importantly, fixes, because nobody likes someone who complains without offering any solutions. So that's our agenda for the day. Let's start a little bit about myself and my background. So my name is Cortez Frazier Jr. I'm a product lead at a company called Fossa. We manage open source management and software bill of materials from a lifecycle perspective. Prior to joining Fossa as a product manager, I worked for a company called Puppet. Actually met a few ex-Puppet employees since I've been here, which has been really exciting. From there, I was building up a CSPM cloud security posture management tool. Built that from the ground up from a SaaS perspective, delivered it, had a lot of success there. And then prior to that, I was actually in a practitioner seat, so honestly in a lot of the shoes like you all today. I was working for GE Power, now called GE Vernova, as they go through their transition. I was responsible for about 1,800 developers, 600 applications, and only about 3 of us on the team. So we had a large coverage area with a very, very small amount of resources. That was my first experience with how do I start to deal with a lot of these enterprise problems at scale? How do we use software and automation in order to address them? And then most importantly, how do we kind of move away from security theater practices to ones that will actually get you the impact that you're looking for? My wonderful company, Fossa, we do both open source management, so you can think about a traditional software composition analysis tool, and then of course, software bill of materials lifecycle management, which I will talk to you more about what that means here throughout the rest of this conversation. So let's jump into it, right? If we think about what is an SBOM, you've likely heard this word at some point in time, most likely probably about 2 years ago now, when Log4j happened. For those not aware, Log4j is a open source package that a lot of people are using, and ended up being extremely vulnerable, allowing for remote code execution, and the whole world started to freak out, frankly. At this point in time, software composition analysis existed, but a lot of people didn't have as much coverage as they were looking for. I know at my time in GE, we were essentially doing regex queries across our GitHub environment, trying to figure out scraping across manifest files where these components are used. For anybody who works deeply in component analysis, you know how ridiculous that approach is, and how insecure and unsafe that was. But nonetheless, it was the tools that we had available to us. And so as you think about Executive Order 14028, that really kind of kicked off this whole journey for us as a nation and frankly as a world, as we start to think about software bill of materials. You can think about this like an ingredient list. At the end of the day, it is still a bill of materials for all of your components and software. And then let's kind of do a little bit about regulatory timeline. I'm going to go much deeper here on SBOM here in a bit, but I do want you to understand like where a lot of these pushes are coming from and where this sense of urgency. So as I said, we kicked it off with Executive Order 14028. Biden administration went ahead and made a mandate that anyone who's doing business with the United States government is going to have to start to produce a inventory of components. Something you'll notice in a lot of these regulations is they very rarely call out SBOMs directly, and so you can think of SBOMs of the medium by which that you deal with a lot of these regulations, but very rarely are they going to say specifically you need to use this SBOM in this format with this information. Now, shortly after that, it's like, all right, great, we have this executive order, what do we do now? NTIA thankfully came along and said, well, you need to have some minimal elements. You need to include things like component name, the authors, the suppliers, the originators, which I will explain in a little bit more detail here, and why that information is important when you're starting to think about vulnerability remediation. From there, of course, we then start to trickle down into individual government organizations. And so if you think about anyone who has to do payment processing or credit card terminals, materials, they have to comply with PCI 4.0 DSS. They have now added within, I think, 6.3.2b, a requirement for, once again, a bespoke inventory of your software components. This is a very verbose way to say software bill of materials. That requirement is going to come in hard on March of 2025, but a lot of organizations are already preparing now as they know they need to comply to these things. From there, we start to get international with requirements. If anybody's familiar with the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA, dealing with the European Union, has actually now called out SBOM specifically as a requirement. Now they have, continued to soften language over time. They started with you have to remediate every single known vulnerability, which once again, anyone who operates in the vulnerability space knows how ridiculous that request is. But nonetheless, being able to at least display what vulnerabilities you have and then whether you're actually exploitable based off of how you're using those specific components is now the language that the CRA has started to march towards. And once again, software bill of materials begins to be the medium by which that you can answer a lot of these questions. The most important regulatory timeline that's starting to come up, or the one that's putting a lot of pressure on customers, is from the FDA. The FDA already has hard requirements, and so if you do any medical device manufacturing or are looking to do any submissions throughout the course of this year, you are now required to submit a software bill of materials, and you also have to prove that you have no known vulnerabilities, both from a CISA known exploitable vulnerability perspective, and then any detected vulnerabilities with some type of tooling. And I'll kind of talk to you how you can go ahead and prove that. Now, one of the things that you may be asking yourself is, well, if I don't do payment processing or if I don't do any medical device manufacturing, do I have to care about this? And I think the bold answer is yes. And the reason why is because these requirements are going to trickle down to customers of customers of customers. And so you may not directly be submitting to the FDA, but if any of your customers are, they're going to have to require software bill of materials from you in order for you to prove that the components that they're building on top of are safe to use and don't have any known vulnerabilities. Alrighty, let's kind of hop into a little bit more information, go a little bit more granular on what software bill of materials are and how they begin to play out from a tactical perspective. First, who should care about them, right? We already kind of talked a little bit about some personas that may want to care. First and foremost, if you are a producer of software and you do any business whatsoever with any government organization, or as I said, customers of customers, then you have to care about this because you'll be required to. But in addition, if you're a purchaser of software, if we think back to, once again, Executive Order 1428, a lot of that was in response to SolarWinds, which you may or may not be familiar with. SolarWinds was a massive cybersecurity attack that happened very, very widespread. And ultimately, I can assure you, every person who purchased SolarWinds wished they had a software bill of materials for SolarWinds on that day, and they would have been able to have much more responsive mitigation as compared to a very reactive approach that we all ultimately had to go through. And so if you're purchasing any software, if you want to purchase Slack and you want to make sure that Slack's not using any open source components that you're worried about, then you can consume that software bill of materials or you can command them. This is actually oftentimes also important for suppliers. And so if you're building any software on top of your suppliers, or if you're doing M&A from a due diligence perspective, you want to know what type of tech debt are you getting yourself into, what type of vulnerability debt, what type of license attributions concerns are you going to have. And once again, that SBOM is the medium by which that you're able to display that information. And then lastly, operators. And that was more so the space that I was in as a cybersecurity architect. How do I ensure that if I can't have direct coverage with an SEA tool, that my developers can supply an SBOM to me? I can then ingest that and still have that single pane of glass across where all components are being used. In addition to, who should care, why should I care, right? And I won't spend too much time here, but you can ultimately think of SBOMs being the software, what the food labels were to any food or packaging. Very, very similar requirements. Help me understand what's in it so I can decide how much sugar I'd like to consume on a daily basis. So let's kind of get a little bit more granular about examples of software bill of materials, right? It's kind of this very nebulous term until you understand what it looks like. It has many, many components. There's kind of two primary formats, CycloneDX and SPDX. I'm currently showing CycloneDX at the moment. And there are different chunks, if you will, of information, starting with the SBOM metadata itself. And so help me understand who produced it, what specification am I following, what version, published date, all this kind of very, very generic information to help you give a source of truth of essentially who you should go back and harass if any of the information is incorrect or if you need to get an updated version. The tooling in particular is important here because something you'll notice across SBOM generators is everyone does it slightly different, which is the data normalization problem that I'll speak about here in a bit. So having a really good context in particular on what SBOM format, in this case CycloneDX, and then what specification version, 1.4, are the two most important things that you want to worry about. And then from there, from like an NTIA perspective, you have to have author, you have to have supplier, and you have to have the tool that generated your software bill of materials. And so you can see that all play out here kind of across this various metadata. I am going to send out these slides. This is based off of a sample application that I've created myself, my recipe book. It's publicly available, so you can review that, both the CycloneDX and SPDX versions of this, to have a little bit more of a granular conversation. As we move past the SBOM metadata, you then get into components. So I've now given you general information on what's in the SBOM itself. Now we need to enumerate every single component that's included there. And you can see information, once again, very similar: author, supplier, what licenses are included. And there's one field in particular that I want you to pay strong attention to. It's all the way at the bottom of my screen here. It's called the purl. purl stands for package URL. You can see it over here and over here. Package URL is important because this is now your unique identifier for this component, and this is what enables all of the downstream benefits of consuming and generating SBOMs. Without getting too technical, a purl spec normally consists of a namespace. So in this case, npm, right? I want to know where I need to get this component from. A component name, fractional in this case, and then a version, 1.0.0. That is the most basic requirements for a purl. Each component or each purl spec has their own definitions. Linux environments in particular are especially intricate because you have to include things like the distribution, the architecture, and some additional information that's not as necessary for open source components. But if you do not take away anything else from the talk today, whether you're generating SBOMs or importing SBOMs, you should absolutely be requiring a purl included at all times, and make sure that it is fully qualified and correctly specified. And this is the trap that most people run into, is they produce a purl, but it's not to spec, and thus it cannot be independently verifiable, and thus the entire SBOM process begins to fall down. Moving from the component metadata, you then begin to unlock where I believe most of the value of a software bill of materials come from, which is this concept of vulnerability exploitability exchange. So as I kind of briefly alluded to earlier, if you spend time in the vulnerability remediation space, you understand very often that 90+% of the vulnerabilities that the various scanners detect, you're actually not impacted by. There's lots of reasons why. You may have some inline mitigation in place. You may not be using the vulnerable function. You may not be shipping the part of the component that's vulnerable because it's a test dependency and not a compile dependency, right? There's many, many, many reasons why someone may not be able to actually use or exploit that CVE. Oftentimes too, if you spend any time looking through CVE descriptions, you'll see that they're only is exploitable with this one hyper-specific network configuration where you have to supply a 256 character file, and if you don't do this exact order of events, then once again the CVE, which may be critical, instantly becomes not exploitable. And so in order to address this pain point, the CycloneDX from the OWASP organization went ahead and defined the spec around VEX, which you'll commonly hear, or the vulnerability exploited exchange. This starts with some high-level metadata on the vulnerability itself, right? What's the CVE, CWE, severity, all this very generic information, and then you get into the interesting part with the exploitability information. And so you'll always see a status, whether that's affected or not affected. Affected is pretty straightforward because that means that you are potentially exploitable by this and someone needs to remediate it immediately. Not affected is where things get very, very interesting, because you then start to have different status justifications associated with that not affected status. So do I have inline mitigation in place? Do I have some component analysis outside of the way that this component is being used, and thus that vulnerable function is not reachable, right? And all the reasons that are included here. And then lastly, a detail. The detail is actually a hidden piece that a lot of people skip or don't provide as much information on, but is incredibly valuable for you as someone who's ingesting SBOMs, because you then have to decide your own risk tolerance, right? For me, an organization may say, which I'll jump over to an example. So this is an example of a affected vulnerability, right? And so once again, we have all kinds of CVE metadata information there, letting you know the severity, letting you know all the kind of good stuff that you need to worry about from a description and how to deal with this vulnerability. But most importantly, you can see down here with my status of affected, which means that I am communicating to anyone consuming this SBOM that they should be worried about this vulnerability. In comparison, they can also provide a status of not affected. And so in this case, I've just kind of scoped down to the analysis portion of it. All the same vulnerability information from above will be included. However, you have a status of not affected. Most importantly, you have a justification for why. Maybe some additional information. Will this be fixed? Will this not be fixed? And then that detail. And I continue to harp on the detail because what you will notice is, as an organization, you have to decide for yourself, is this good enough for me, right? Am I going to trust that the person who's producing this SBOM is actually confirming that the code's not reachable, or from my perspective, the code exists and thus that risk is too high for me, and I actually would consider this to be an effective status. And that is why being able to truly understand and categorize these different analyses and having tooling that will display that for you becomes critical. Alrighty, now I think everyone should have really detailed understanding of what a software bill of materials is, what kind of government regulations got us to this point, and then what type of benefits can come from including a VEC statement. So let's talk about some problems that you're going to run into. The biggest problem, without a doubt, is data normalization, which it's a fancy word to basically say that crap in equals crap out. And so if you think about the specification, CycloneDX, SPDX, very structured. You have to have an author field, right? But it does not tell you what has to be in that author field. It gives you an intent, it gives you a desire, but there's really no strong ways to verify that. Simple examples are at the metadata level, when I was showing you earlier, is the author myself as Cortez Frazier generating this SBOM, or is it the tooling that's generating this SBOM on my behalf? Am I doing this in CI on a regular basis? And thus it's now a bot account, frankly, that is generating this. All this information is completely up to your own interpretation, and that's where the data normalization becomes very tricky. Supplier is the exact same way. The intent of supplier is the person who is distributing a component. In a world where we're using package managers, what does that even mean? Is that the package manager that's distributing the component? Is it I use React and thus Meta is actually the distributor of this component? All of these things are highly up for interpretation, and this is where one of the biggest problems, frankly, begins to come from. And then the last one, which is kind of called out in my screenshot here, is around CPEs. And I do want to spend a little bit of time kind of enumerating this problem. So CPE stands for Common Product Enumeration. This is the MVD's way to go and display vulnerabilities for both closed and open source products. It is their first attempt at a unique identifier. This came along before the purl spec was created. I will tell you very bluntly, I think CPs are crap. I think they're terrible. I think it's the worst possible way that you could go about enumerating a product. And the reason is clearly displayed here, which is for this exact same component, right? Python, Django, and these exact same version, there's about 9 different ways that somebody could go and create a CPE for this. And CPEs are also only created when a vulnerability exists. And so you can imagine a world where I am attempting to follow the CPE spec. I then generate a CPE. I go to look this up in the MVD, and I find no results. And so I'm like, oh, great, I have no vulnerabilities. That is not true. You just misformatted your CPE, and thus the search did not detect it. And this is very minute problem, but this is a process that almost every enterprise follows today, which is they do CPE lookup, and that is missing vulnerabilities, and that is false because a CPE will only ever be created if there is a vulnerability, which does you no good for future enumeration. And so, once again, going back to my original statement, if you don't remember any other takeaways, use purls, generate purls, demand them of your customers if you're going to have any form of software bill of materials program in your environment. Biggest takeaway here is mainly trust but verify. Make sure that you're actually looking at the content that's coming out from your SBOMs. Ensure that it's not just fulfilling a check mark and ensuring that you have a supplier field included, but is the intent of these fields actually being reached as defined by the specifications themselves. And of course, you can trust high quality tooling to be able to demonstrate that for you as well. From there, you start to get into problems around vulnerability remediation. And so what is very, very common with a software bill of materials is that you're going to provide that to someone. That person is then going to ingest that software bill of materials, whether they do that manually with their own scripting, whether they use some tooling like Fossa to do that, or some of the other open source tooling out there. And then they will start to remediate any vulnerabilities or manage vulnerabilities that are popping up from that. If you do a purl focused approach, then you will actually be taking that unique identifier. You'll go out, you'll grab that package, and now anytime new vulnerabilities come up to place, you'll have access to those because you have that unique identifier. And that's actually very, very critical when you think about vulnerability remediation, which is regardless of if your components have changed in any way, shape, or form for a specific build or revision. New vulnerabilities are 100% still coming out for them. And so the date that you actually generate your SBOM from a VEX perspective, it is obsolete. Because there is no guarantee that a new vulnerability hasn't come out that same day and a new extremely critical one has not. Now, a lot of people take VEX-focused approach, which I think is a good input, but I think this is one of the big problems with software bill of materials, and it goes back to that difference in risk tolerance, meaning that if I'm an organization and I'm saying that I'm not worried because the vulnerable code is not controlled by an adversary, but me as an organization operates in critical infrastructure, I'm unwilling to take that risk. And so from my perspective, that is still an affected vulnerability, and I have to treat it as such. And so my key kind of takeaway or recommendation for you is frankly to take a hybrid approach, command those purls, monitor any new vulnerabilities that are coming through with some high quality tooling, and then use the VEX as inputs so that way you're not drowning in 10,000 CVs and have no way to go around navigating them. Deal with the ones that are being determined affected, move to not affected, categorized by the justification, so you can then apply your own risk tolerance based off of your organization. Kind of the last big problem that I'll talk to you about before I kind of finish it out and do a little bit of Q&A here, which is secure distribution. And so most people today, when they supply SBOMs to people, they just send it via email, right? Or you send a Google Drive file, your OneNote, whatever your cloud platform of choice is. As I was already mentioning earlier, the moment that that SBOM is generated, it's completely obsolete. And thus that is a failure on both the distributor and someone trying to consume it. In addition, there's no controls there, right? Where your granular RBAC controls, who should have access to these bill of materials? While yes, it is difficult for someone to essentially reverse engineer your entire product based off of components alone, you also are not looking to give unnecessary information to threat actors who don't need to have it. And so the more that you can have like a true distribution pipeline that is fully hosted and allows for you to move SBOMs away from this point in time document that you're creating and now a living document that you can share with someone, they can have access to on an online platform, and every single time a new vulnerability comes out, you can go ahead and mitigate that, right? You can apply a VEX update, let them know that they're actually not affected by this vulnerability, rather than them harassing you and freaking you out. And then it automatically appears in their portal for them to then see that information and alleviate their own internal policies. And so the more that you move away from this, let me generate and share this document, and the more that you move into, how do I create a living experience around this document, the better off you'll be as you scale a software bill of materials program. With that, I think I only have like a minute and some change left, and so I do want to kind of call out, obviously I'd be remiss if I did not mention that my company will do all of this for you, frankly. We are a software bill of material lifecycle management company. We will both generate SBOMs in a high quality way, including VEX statements with attestations included in them. We will also support importing SBOMs, in particular with the purl, but even if you don't have it, we'll read from the bill of materials, we'll include your license information, go out and grab those components, and then we will supply distribution, starting publicly now, and then we'll be adding RBAC and granular controls over top of this. And so from a distribution to a monitoring to a generation perspective, you can have all bases covered, all within one product and all of them one pane of glass. So I won't spend too much time there. Come visit us at our booths. We're happy to bore your heads with as much conversation as you would like to have. But at the end of the day, the more that you can move away from these homegrown products, these inefficient products that are doing manual processes and manual lookups, the better off we and the entire world will be. So with that, I'll go ahead and close and open up for any questions.
to run if there's questions in the audience. So,
Any questions, anybody?
oh, there's a hand back there.
Oh, yep. Hold on, I'm coming.
My name is Chris, and I just have a simple kind of application question of SBOMs. And with open source software, there's some packages that are authored by anonymous people of pseudonyms. Like, how does that apply to either if I'm producing SBOMs with open source software or I'm consuming them? And, you know, looking to the future, would that like affect my process where I might want to start excluding either software and or basically vouch for the software that I'm kind of controlling it instead of directly from upstream?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will answer the question with kind of two halves of that, right? Which is, I think, one is your own internal risk tolerance from a policy perspective. Are you comfortable using components that are coming from anonymous sources? And there's a lot of organizations who are not, right? They need to understand country of origin. They need to understand the contributor's history and background. What other components have they contributed to? Is it actually consistently being maintained and updated on a regular basis and it's not abandoned? And that, for me, is like a completely risk tolerance focused conversation and one that each individual organization has to, you know, kind of take on their own. My personal opinion is I actually don't think anonymous packages are inherently nefarious in any way. I think kind of then segueing into the second half of that conversation, the most important part is that unique identifier, because the bigger risk is that that anonymous package is being hosted in a well-known source such as like, you know, PyPy or, you know, any of the other Python distributions. However, somebody's then forked that, they've then posted another anonymous version of this where they've done nefarious things to, and now they host it on their own private registry, right, for example. And thankfully, the purl will be able to include that unique information to be able to distinguish between those. And so validating that source and make sure that you have confidence in that original source is probably the more important aspect, from my opinion, than ensuring that you have, you know, fully identified author and supplier information. But that's a really good question.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? I don't think I see hands.
Awesome. Well, thank you for inviting me out. I really had a good time. Definitely let me know. I'll be around in the booth if you want to talk a little bit more details about what it looks like to kind of build and scale out a software bill of materials program in your organization. And yeah, until next time, take care.
Woo!
and since you're here from Atlanta, how's the Atlanta tech scene? Anything people should know about Atlanta?
Oh, the Atlanta tech scene is absolutely fantastic, actually. They allegedly are calling it the Silicon Valley of the South, but I think Austin might have a claim to that fame as well.
Silicon Hills over here.
Yeah.
So the bigger debate is Texas the South or is Georgia the South?
Ooh.
I don't know if I want to answer that.
Me either. I feel like that's a lose-lose answer. However, you probably could have your doors open in February in Atlanta the same way we have that weather here.
Oh, 100%. And the food's just as delicious. So
that's true.
Barbecue.
That way, look me up.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.